How are you doing, Joey?
I'm doing really good. How about you guys?
Is everybody well? I know Brittany's not doing too happy, but Van is being very pleasant. It's kind of unnerving.
Yeah, the van energy.
Like a friend of mine moved to Logan. He just talking about Utah towns, and he said it's really irritating by how nice everybody is. He's just not used to it. You're waiting for the Twilight music and Rod Serling to pop up in the background or something.
It's coming.
Well, I hope that you guys had a good week, and I hope you guys have fun stuff planned for this next week, to at least unwind a little bit. It looks like I'm going to be driving up to Utah County, Salt Lake County, right around there, to do another workshop. But a friend of mine passed away, just a really, really decent guy. He's a World War II vet, and he worked on the Civilian Conservation Corps, just a lifetime of memories. And the daughter of or one of his kids is the executor, and we were just visiting this last week. He's a nice guy. Everybody in the family's nice, but things are happening where just people are translating their grief to just anger and frustration. And that's a hard thing to deal with. I think that's really tough. And, bless her heart, she has infinite patience. She's really dealing with a lot. And we were visiting because I was in the same position with my mom like 20 years ago. And, it takes a while, but after a while, everybody calmed down. It was relatively nice. It took 7 years in one case and 20 years in another, but still it happened, which is nice. But anyways, are you guys planning anything fun for this next week? No, nothing. I think when I get back from the workshop, I'm going to do just loads and loads of boring stuff, and then I'll be ready to go to school again. Well, do you guys remember what we talked about last week?
Yeah, surrealism.
Surrealism. And so far, from the beginning of the 20th century, there's been several movements that we've touched on. Tail end of Fauvism, or a little bit of Fauvism, tail end of post-impressionism and expressionism, Cubism, futurism, a whole bunch of isms. Dada, surreal, Bauhaus, blah, 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 blah. And all of this stuff, most of the stuff, I should say, that we're talking about has been in Europe and a little bit in Russia and a little bit in the US. But most of it is Europe, and Europe has there's a lot of stuff going on. And it is really kind of frustrating to me that most of art history we're dealing with, not art historians today, but the way it's been structured, we are dealing with this very Eurocentric view of the art world. But unfortunately, the reality is, because of the way economics are driven, right now, people are in a position where most of what they do is reflective to that relationship with Eurocentric art history. People are either working against it or pushing it into different directions. But that's the narrative structure that everybody deals with. Like at UVU, I helped to restructure the canon of artists so that they weren't all, or 95% white male Europeans. We put in Ai Weiwei and Elana Tsui and Betty Saar, just really, super geniuses in the art world, where even though they were producing 20 years ago when I was going through stuff, Nobody knew about them. And it's absolutely like I was in a meeting about 10 years ago at BYU, and I was talking about the artists that we could get at BYU as part of the Arab Spring. And the response was, well, are there any real good Muslim artists? I mean, really, honestly. I was like, it's not their fault they had no idea. It's just we have this world view, or not a worldview, but we have myopic vision sometimes about things. And but it works both ways. The first real art movement in the U.S. was the Hudson River School. That was kind of a bunch of artists were trained in Europe and then came back home to the U.S. And it was a fusion of realism and romanticism, and that really reflected this politicized hopefulness of white America at the time. And it was a lot of really beautiful landscape work that was done. And it was still, I mean, nobody in Europe took it seriously at all because, I mean, who cared? For a lot of them, it wasn't even on their radar. Mary Cassatt, who was one of the greatest impressionists, nobody even cared about her work until she exhibited in France. And, she was American. And it's, which I think is hilarious, because if you were in the 16th century in Europe, you couldn't really call yourself a gentleman or a gentlewoman or be a member of the self-respecting nobility or royalty unless you had a Christian-themed wood carving done by a Mexican Baroque artist. It's just, so it's funny to me how this stuff kind of moves around. And but today, this week, what we're going to be talking about is one of the most astonishing art movements, I think, and it's because of it really is an expression of the American dream of self-determinism, which was the American response to the divine right of kings of, European tradition. You have this really strong pioneering self-determinism, and it came from a source where people were forced to either become self-determinist or die, essentially, and they chose hope. So the Harlem Renaissance, I think, is a beautifully envisioned period of or art movement, as well as something that really demonstrates a positive outcome of just a really horrific history, and I think it's pretty astounding. So that's what we're talking about, 1917 to about 1937. But even that isn't entirely accurate, because it started a little bit before then, and it is still going on today. The Harlem Renaissance is still echoing today, and it is echoing in an awful lot of things, and it is echoing internationally too, which I think is really cool. And one of the most ironic things for me is jazz is a child of the Harlem Renaissance. And for a while, it was bigger in France than it was in most places in the U.S., which I think is kind of interesting. But I wanted to share this with you. Let's see if I can. Give me a short 3 hours, and we'll have it up and running. Okay, this is Horace Pippin. And even though the Harlem Renaissance is recognized as really taking place between 1917 and 1937, it's kind of like the Italian Renaissance that kind of took place between 1350 and 1550, but the architecture moved forward another couple hundred years, and the Renaissance painting actually started a little bit earlier. So, again, it didn't start June 17th, 1917. Those are just approximate dates. But I chose this to open it up. This is from Horace Pippin. He was a painter of the Harlem Renaissance, and his work is pretty much autobiographical, the return from World War I. And I think there's some fascinating things going on in here. But as we look at this, I think this is a good demonstration. I'm sorry, I have the painting enlarged and nobody can see it. This is a really good demonstration, I think, of what the Harlem Renaissance kind of represents. By that I mean most of the artists and architects that participate, and there were writers and playwrights and all sorts of stuff, but most of them took what their contemporaries around the world were doing and put their own spin on it. And so the movement is more a movement of cognition and neuroplasticity, using the visual language that had been built over the last 20 years. And so I think this is really kind of interesting. So this was done 1941, beginning of World War II, and it's a recollection at the end of World War I. And there's a couple interesting things that are going on here. And I don't know if you guys, if everybody can see this that's going on. We have demonstrations of war, the flying aces falling and burning, the artillery, the trench warfare. All these guys have their helmets and uniforms on. But there's a couple of things that I want you to look at. One is the textural background that's been developed with just building texture into the paint itself, right through here. There's a certain element of kind of a soft fauvism, but it's mostly, I think, a feeling of collage, which is really interesting because this collage style of painting moves forward and was really popular for like children's books in the 60s and 70s as well. But so we have heavily textured paint. And then look at the 9 human figures. And the 9 living human figures, and tell me what you see. Can you guys see the 9 human figures? Notice that all the ones wearing uniforms with the helmets are white. And these 3 men represent the black soldiers, black American soldiers going against the Germans. So these are all German soldiers. And these 3 black men are going against them, and they're cleaning their clocks. But it's interesting to me because it is very hard to make out these figures. When in World War I, experience for a lot of the Allied nations was that everybody would go. Everybody was brothers on and off the battlefield while they were there. But when it came to things like officer clubs and then coming back home, it was essentially only the whites were allowed. Only parades were given for the whites. If you were Indigenous Australian, if you were Indigenous American, if you were Black American, anything other than white European descendants, then you were pretty much ignored. And I hear stories about the Indigenous Australians coming home who they would sneak them drinks out of the back of the officers' mess because they weren't allowed inside the officers' hall, even though 3 weeks earlier when they were in Europe fighting against the Germans, they were all saving each other's lives. They were brothers. And the same experience happened with the Americans coming home too. That there was only one color on the battlefield, and it was green. But when you come home, it's a very different story. And I think Horace Pippin's painting kind of addresses that. But this encapsulates a lot of the what was going on with the Harlem Renaissance. First off, he knows what he's doing artistically, and this is an expression that's dealing with other movements and other styles that are present in the world landscape at the time. And coupling that, the expertise coupled with that is a very distinctive perspective that is very different from European counterparts. And I think that kind of duality, where you have artists that are trained and fit on the world stage, but dealing with a perspective that is very, very different, is really an interesting duality that's manifest. And to introduce the Harlem Renaissance, I really wanted to share with you the fairy godfather of the Harlem Renaissance, who is, do you guys know much about Frederick Douglass? I think that for an introduction to Frederick Douglass, we cannot get any better than Morpheus. So the reason why I wanted to introduce that, and I also include an article that is just excerpts from one of his incredibly powerful speeches, which is called The Self-Made Man. And I should point out that at this time, the male gendered pronoun was a cultural artifact, and it's obvious from what Frederick Douglass spent his life from 1848 forward on doing. It's obvious that when he used the term he or man, he is referencing all of humanity, because he was a suffragist, and he actually got beat up because he was wanting women to get their vote, which I'm laughing not because it's funny. I just he is an example of, when we talk about cultural artifacts, it is difficult to judge another culture and what they do by the standards that we have today. And for Frederick Douglass, when he uses terms like man or self-determination of man, he's talking about self-determination of everybody. So I wanted to make that clear. But he felt that the invention of the camera was a true God-given miracle, because it enabled absolutely anybody to present themselves to the world in whatever manner they chose. And he said that it was the most democratic art form, which I thought was pretty cool. He was the most photographed man of the 19th century. But the reason why that is important is because 20 years after his death, when World War I, when the U.S. was preparing to join World War I, a lot of factories started opening production in the North, and they needed a lot of workers. And about half of the Black Americans that were living in the South moved out of the South. It's called the Great Migration. And out of that, a huge percentage of them settled in 45 square blocks of New York in the neighborhood called Harlem. And that's where this started. And so these are people who are really embodying that American vision of self-determination as opposed to divine right, which I think is pretty cool. And he was the one that inspired the artists, the playwrights, the politicians that were really the players of the Harlem Renaissance. And of course, what does Renaissance mean? It's rebirth, and this is essentially a rebirth of cultural identity for the 200,000 people that moved into New York from the Southern states. Oh, and the windows on my computer I have one of those touch pads, and sometimes it is not sensitive at all, and sometimes it is hypersensitive. So when I look confused, it's because it's being hypersensitive. So I wanted to, this is about 2 minutes long, and I wanted to play this for you. It's an introduction to the Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance is a rare blooming of artistic talent. It's the sort of thing that cities are always looking for, where we get this critical mass of talent in one place at one time. Now, the Harlem Renaissance happens between 1919 and 1925 in Harlem, which would become the center of African American culture. African American painters, novelists, sculptors, poets, and musicians would join in this artistic outpouring. And they're coming to New York due to this migration from the South of African Americans looking for jobs in the industrializing North. This happens during World War I, when, of course, all of these factories in the North are producing armaments for the war effort. So it's going to draw people from the South. Now, there is some controversy about the Harlem Renaissance. It's sometimes seen as isolationist or in some way conventional, but it does explore some broad themes such as African folklore and the daily life of the African American community, which, remember, we're before civil rights, so things look very different then than they do today. They celebrate their history and culture, not only in art, but of course in poetry, literature, and so many other forms. W.E.B. Du Bois and other intellectuals would spearhead the movement and give it some intellectual base on which the art is going to be built.
So, just looking at that, you can see a little bit of the artwork has resonance with other movements that we've seen already. Some of the visual artwork, and this is something, like I mentioned before, that characterizes the Harlem Renaissance to a good degree, is that other movements that were popular elsewhere in the world are explored, but with the particular personal history of, I say personal, the cultural history of the group of creatives that were in Harlem. And it didn't just take place in New York, it was elsewhere too, but it's called the Harlem Renaissance because the principal influencers were all living in New York at the time. And there's I also have several other videos and stuff like that for you guys to watch and look at. And I wanted to, let's see, share some examples, just some visual examples of what's going on. And I think what's interesting is, as you look at this, I would like you to think about, what other movements we have seen and how they're reflected in the work that you see, but also how it resonates forward to today as well. And there's a couple really specific examples we can look at. I think, these are all three by the same artist. There's examples of painters and photographers as well. The Harlem Renaissance photography, these are just documentary photographs. The Harlem Renaissance photography, I don't have a lot of it in this. It's mostly painting and sculpture. But what was interesting to me is there's a very strong awareness of drama. And it looks to me more like Stieglitz. They were heavily influenced by Stieglitz, having that kind of drama, that kind of chiaroscuro. And just the photographs out of the Harlem Renaissance are not just documentary at all. They're pregnant with narrative, and they're really fascinating. So I don't have a lot of those examples, but I wanted to share this other stuff with you that I think will be a surprise. I mean, you look at something like this on the top right, and it feels very much like, these two images feel very much like a blend of Cubism and Russian constructivism. I think, very, very strong lines. This style of painting reminds me very much of kind of a graphic Matisse kind of vision. And we look at some of these woodcuts, they remind me quite a bit of woodcuts that were done by Picasso and the artists that later made up Dada. But just some very interesting stuff. And then of course you get the realistic portraiture that was very contemporary as well as other expressive stuff. And then here's some something that feels like it's a little bit more influenced by Cubism. But then we get these kinds of figurative works, and it's stuff that would not be out of place at any of the European museums at the time either. I mean, these guys are not just artists that are called artists because somebody wants to give them a bone. These are guys artists or creatives who are classically trained, professional, know their stuff, and they were in demand around the world, really at this time. And then here's some, so this is more influenced by what Europeans were doing. This is more influenced by historical work that was going on at this time in Nigeria, for example. Some of this, very Yoruba. And then you can see some resonance here. What I think is so interesting is that this is done by somebody living in Harlem whose grandparents had been slaves, whose great-grandparents had been brought over from Africa, and it is influenced by Cubism, which in turn was influenced by the artwork that very possibly had been made by their great-grandparents. Which is absolutely interesting to me. Very, very interesting. And that kind of level of irony was not lost on any of the participants at all. Because I think it's pretty amazing stuff. And I wanted to share a little bit of the architecture that's going on as well. And then we'll spend more time looking at individual artists. This is the Seventh-day Adventist Christian Church. And, oh, I'm sorry, sharing this tab instead. There we go. This is actually done by Vertner Woodson Tandy, who is the first Black American architect that received an architectural license from the state of New York. And looking at this this is just one of his buildings, but there's some really interesting things that I think are going on that I think are kind of exciting. And it's not because this is all revolutionary, but he's putting some things together that help to kind of define a certain visual style that is still being reflected on. What are some of the things that you notice about this architecture?
To me, it almost feels like Moroccan or something. I don't know.
Well, and I think particularly in this kind of area and with the texture going on around these, the rounds right here, I think that there's definitely some of that going on. And I see there's this kind of Romanesque influence too going on with the arches and stuff, and the pillar heads. There's kind of there's an interesting take on the Corinthian pillar head that I think is really fascinating. And there's this work up here, this grid work up here is very reminiscent of some of the stuff that we saw from Art Nouveau, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, this kind of dental molding around the Roman arches is fascinating to me. He used stained glass, so kudos to him. You know, that's always, whenever an architect can fit stained glass into something, it's good for them. Anything else? One thing that I notice is that it is designed to fit into the cityscape. It is not designed to, it's not designed specifically to stand out. You know, you have just the brick facade on the side there, which is very much part of the urban landscape. See the Widow's Walk frontispiece right up here, which is really kind of a nice decorative piece. What I'm seeing is a fusion of a lot of different architectural styles coming together, not like a collage, but because they looked interesting to put together. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if this was the front to a Masonic hall either. You know, it has that very much 1920s era, no alcohol on the premises kind of architecture feel. But it also feels like it's a coming together of a lot of different styles. And I really like that. I think it's fascinating because I think it becomes a metaphor for what's going on culturally at this time too. As people, you know, when people struggle to find their own identity, I think one of the big struggles is finding that identity as it relates to the history of your family. That can be a real big problem. And the elements that are in here, I think, kind of reflect some of that picking out of history, just like how people reestablish their identity after some cultural trauma like this. I wanted to share some other work. This is a mansion of a millionaire in Harlem. And you look at this, and I think there's some really interesting things going on in this as well. See, there's the Ionic column heads here. So there's a lot of that Romanesque kind of influence. You got the Widow's Walk detail up here. We have kind of a villa clay tile roof going on. And what is interesting to me is, it doesn't feel like it's cobbled together. It feels like it's all really well thought out, and it feels consistent. It feels like an updated Romanesque style design. And but I guess the point I'm trying to make is it demonstrates that this guy does know exactly what he's doing. And there are other examples of his work as well, but I think that's the big thing. He is an architect that does know what he's doing. And I do have a video here to share about him. Give me just a little bit here. Okay, yeah, this is only about 3 minutes long. We don't need to watch the rest of it. The rest of it is basically saying the same kind of thing. This is a back view of that mansion, which I think is a lot more impressive than the front view. I think that it's pretty amazing, but a lot of Roman influence, I think, on that. And then this is one of the churches that he did. I just think it's pretty amazing that you know, a person in Black America at this, or in America at this time, a Black man in America at this time, you're still dealing with a lot of the weight of post-slavery, and even in anti-slave states, even in Union states, there was a lot of nasty negativity. And it's, you know, you hear about these guys. This guy was at Cornell, made the first African American fraternity, you know, in the history of the country, did all this other stuff. The other architects we look at are going to be the same. You know, he first licensed architect in the state of New York, who's Black. All these guys, all these artists, the men and women both, are like that, of that kind of caliber. They're all pioneers. And on one hand, that's really sad that they had to all be pioneers. You know what I mean? That's the first time but on the other hand, all of them really took Frederick Douglass's words to heart and determined to build the world that they wanted to live in. You know, like Gandhi said 30 years later. And I am trying to get back to, there we go. There we go. The next one I want to look at is William Sidney Pittman, who was another architect. And it's interesting to me because he, like the first one, Tandy was from Kentucky. This guy is from, oh, I can't remember. I think he was from, I think he was from Alabama, and he moved to Washington, D.C., and then he settled in New York. So he was the Tuskegee had one of the first all-Black universities, and he was the campus architect for them. But as he moved around, he did a lot of other things too. And it's there's, you know, this is what's interesting to me is that the work of these architects, it's very solidly American architecture. I mean, even though there's a lot of Roman-esque influence, it still feels very much part of the American landscape. This is one of the churches that he did. This is became an apartment building. And this is the YMCA, but it was used as an apartment building for a while. But it's interesting because it feels very strongly in that same time period. You know, the 1920s. You have dental molding right up here. You have a little bit harsher lines that's very reminiscent of the Prohibition. You know, that's what was going on at the time, and I think it's very interesting. So he did a lot of stuff in Tuskegee, but he was also a big product. I mean, this feels like it's kind of revisiting colonial style architecture too, but with a lot of those Romanesque elements fit in as well, which I think is really, and it's perfect for a university setting. Another church. I don't know. I like these buildings, but I think that people building during the Prohibition times could have been happier. I think that that's pretty amazing. Now, and I say amazing because this person built a lot of buildings. He produced quite a bit, on par with professional architects all around the world, and not just on par with professional architects, but architects who are at the top of their game, which I think is another really cool product of this. And then the third architect I picked is a guy whose name is Robert Robinson Taylor. And he is a pretty remarkable person because he was the first Black alumni of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So, I don't know if we can really feel how important these kinds of things are, because they're not just the first, but they're going against contemporaries who are accepted by society. And it wasn't just, and it was not at all a level playing field for everybody. But what these guys are doing is they are accepted into these universities, these organizations, alongside white contemporaries, with the difference being they have to do 2 or 3 times as much to get a portion of the credit that their white contemporaries are getting. And it's if anybody who doesn't honestly believes that, just look at some of the history of some of the crap that these guys had to go through. So being the first Black student at MIT, the first MIT alumni or alumnus, it's a huge thing because he had a lot of people who hated his guts that were against his appointment. And these are the families that are giving money to the university. So they were taking a huge risk accepting him into the school, and then he ends up being one of the most celebrated alumni in their history, which I think is pretty cool. I wanted to share this.
Hi, I'm Aaron Barnes, and this is The Bigger Picture. Today, we're talking about the United States' first academically trained architect, who was an African-American, Robert Robinson Taylor. Taylor was born in North Carolina shortly after the Civil War, and his father was the slave/son of a white slave owner who eventually purchased his freedom, and his mother was the daughter of free blacks. With this elevated status, Taylor grew up middle class and took up construction from his dad. After some secondary schooling, he worked as a construction foreman before leaving to go to Boston to become the first African-American to attend the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's MIT, for those who don't know. Now, I can barely imagine going to a school like Indiana University as the first Black American, like Marcellus Neal. But this guy went to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and was the first Black guy to do it, and this was in the late 1800s. Are you kidding me? He must have said, forget it, and was just too smart for them to deny, because he ended up getting his degree in 4 years in architecture. Side note, you probably knew this already, but Taylor wasn't the first Black architect in the United States. Architecture sounds complicated, and I guess it is because I'm not an architect. I'm sure that it takes a lot of knowledge and expertise to conduct properly, but architecture in its simplest form is just designing and constructing buildings. There were countless Black people designing and constructing buildings all across the Americas that were probably uneducated, or at least unformally educated in the ways of architecture in the higher education institutions. The entire plantation system in America depended on the work of unpaid, overworked, and underappreciated Black architects. Anyway, let's get back to Bob the Builder. So after he graduated from MIT, he courted several offers from firms who wanted to leverage the expertise that he gained as an architect from MIT. But he decided to take his talents down to Tuskegee, where he became second in command only to Booker T. Washington. While at Tuskegee, he designed most of the buildings there, including the original chapel and the library. He also used his expertise to build up the industrial program there, and use his expertise to guide and supervise students in constructing the buildings on campus, including the first building project, the Science Hall. He went on to design buildings across the country and even designed the Booker T. Washington Institute in Liberia before he died in the original chapel that he built at Tuskegee. It's a shame, you know, that we can't go see this original outstanding achievement by one of our most prolific architects. Does anybody know what happened to that chapel? Oh, it's lost in fire? Okay. It's like so many other pillars of Black achievement in this country. The original chapel at Tuskegee was destroyed by fire not 70 years ago in 1957. I know. Taylor passed on his architectural legacy to his son, who shares the namesake for the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. The family ties don't stop there, though, because his great-granddaughter, Valerie Jarrett, serves as the senior advisor to President Obama today. When Jarrett helped dedicate a United States stamp in her grandfather's honor, she had this to say about him. He believed that with a good education, hard work, relentless determination, and a dedication to family, there were no limits to what he could accomplish. Definitely good values to live by that are evidenced by Taylor's life achievements. Gaining those achievements in a field like architecture that was dominated by white men not only enhanced his life, but opened the doors of opportunity to other African Americans well beyond Robert Robinson Taylor. During his life, Taylor helped build countless buildings, but through the way he lived his life, he built an even longer legacy by showing individuals to reach for seemingly unreachable dreams and see the bigger picture. Thanks for watching.
I kind of enjoy the editorializing too. I think that's kind of fun. That's always enjoyable. But this, though, just carries forward a message that is common to a lot of these artists that were, especially the writers, that were doing things which it seems like they knew a lot of people were going to be watching them and also looking at them from either around the world or from other points in time, because a lot of these artists didn't just do what they enjoyed doing. They did the very best they could with an eye towards positive influence, which I think is pretty cool. And it's interesting to me because you even today you look at the people who are at the top of their game, the artists that are the very best of the best, and they're the same way. I mean, they will they turn around. They know that other people in similar situations are looking at them as examples or mentors, and they turn around and do that. I just think it's interesting because media portrays artists as just feather-headed, self-absorbed, self-destructive types. And it's interesting to me because, like, the artists that I've met that are at the very top, like, you know, I've met the founder of the University of Philosophy in Iran, you know, or the guy that was Corey Archangel, the guy that was at the very front edge of the wave of contemporary digital art. And these guys there's a sense of humor, but there's also a sense of desiring to help everybody coming along as well. And that's something that I think is really impressive, that stands out with these artists too, because they knew very well that there were going to be little girls and little boys looking up to them for you know what they were doing. And as we go on, we're going to go through the rest of these visual artists rather quickly. And they're not just painters. There's also sculptors, not just men. There's women as well. And as we look at them, I invite you to look for evidence that they were influenced or intrigued by the works of other artists contemporary to them. You know, this I think is really kind of an interesting self-portrait. His work feels to me like there's a lot of Gauguin in it. You know, and I think Gauguin was one of the happiest of the Faves, but it just really very interesting to me that there's a lot of that flavor going on. And a lot of his stuff comes at the tail end of the Harlem Renaissance, but it looks to me like he is very influenced by what was going on in Europe Do you guys get that sense as well? Just from these few brief paintings. So and there's a video that I have there as well. We're not gonna watch the video, but it shows quite a bit more of his painting. Well, actually, no. Let's see. I'm not gonna put the sound on, but we'll go through it and look at some of the paintings. Biography, blah blah blah. And then we can start seeing some of his paintings. We just saw a couple in that article, but you can really see that he's developed that style, almost like that Gauguin kind of collage style, like happy fauvism, that I think is really interesting. The thing I'm not seeing is the garish colors. His colors the palette that he uses is a lot more muted, because it feels to me like he has latched onto that style, but is using his own color palette to communicate precisely what he's wanting to. I think which is really interesting. Like on this, the flowers and the sewing are the only things that really have any color. All the rest of it is incredibly muted. And what are you seeing about the subject matter as well?
It looks like he's portraying the circumstances of the daily life, potentially, that he sees around him.
Yeah, and I think some of that is life that's contemporary to him. I think some of that is memories, like his depiction of World War One. He painted that 20 years after the end of the war, and so I wonder if how much of this is personal memories, as well as like this is a personal memory from his time in the service, but there are other things where I wonder if it's recording what people share with him as well. But yeah, I think a lot of it is autobiographical, either his present experience or his memories, of life growing up. And some of these, like, there are some really strong resonances with me. Like on this, the layout, the design, it's reminds me quite a bit of The Return of the Hunters by Peter Bruegel the Elder. You have that same kind of, not because it's exactly laid out the same way, but you have a very similar emotional take on it, where there's life going on in the midst of a rather bleak winter. And I think this is an example for me of kind of that happy fauvism, which probably sells an awful lot better than what the fauvists originally were doing. But I love that because it does feel autobiographical, and it feels very, very real as well.
There's a lot of productivity happening. There's not like a lot of idleness. There's always somebody like quietly working or doing something in almost every frame.
Well, yeah, we were looking at the Expressionists a couple of weeks ago, and it seemed like when they were doing portraits of people, the portraits were always of people laying down, or in repose, I guess is a nicer way of saying it. But in these, yeah, there's productivity, there's activity, definitely. I think I love the style. I think it's a wonderful style. I don't know if we can call it happy fauvism, but that's what I'm going to call it, because I think that kind of fits. But there's a little bit of a resonance in there that reminds me of what Eric Carle did, 40 years later, which is just kind of fun. The next painter we're going to look at is Aaron Douglass. I like the WikiArt sites because a lot of times they'll give like a very short description of who they were. So he was born after the Harlem Renaissance started, but that was probably very definitely a huge part of his upbringing. Looking forward to that, which is probably why he may have trained as an artist. But look at his work. This reminds me of the posters that we see in Russian constructivism, and the Russian what's it called? Alexander Rodchenko, who founded the Russian surrealist photography. It feels like there's a lot of that going on in here. I think it's because you have very graphic depictions of human forms, and then the architectural features they are very stylized, but it feels like the graphical celebration of construction that you see in Russian constructivism. But it feels like the themes are much more central to an American experience. There's folk tales like John Henry, and there's there were 8 principal nations that were slaved, where the people were bought from, and a lot of them have an identity that's directly related to a connection with Mesopotamia and ancient Hebrew culture. So when he's saying "let my people go," there was a very strong belief that the Babylonian diaspora of the Jews, a lot of those people migrated to Western Africa and Southeast Africa. So a lot of people in Zimbabwe and a lot of people in Nigeria were very connected to ancient Jewish tradition. Even today, there's tribes or nations of people in Zimbabwe that read the Torah, and they have done for over 1,000 years. So some really interesting stuff going on. And I love how you see resonance of the folk traditions that were blending of the Orishas and the Protestant Christian traditions. The adaptation of biblical stories, into a visual framework that is consistent to cultural tradition. Just some really beautiful work, and I think it's absolutely amazing. And this all comes at the same time that the Russian constructivists were doing their thing, mid-30s to mid-40s. I think, but if you saw this out of context, would you believe that it was, 80 years old?
Yeah, he would have crushed it with Adobe Illustrator.
Oh yeah, I mean this stuff is just amazing.
Cool.
So I love the work that he's done, and then the titles that he gives. You look at this work by itself, and it's fascinating, it's amazing, and it's incredible. And you start building up your own stories, and then you look at the title, and the title sometimes turns it on its head, sometimes opens another door, and makes it just feel really, really resonant, I think, in a lot of cases. And I think it's absolutely amazing. But I do want to share a video that is a critique of one of his posters, or one of his paintings. Sorry. Again, he does feel to me, though, like there's a little bit of that happy Favism going on, because of the graphic nature of the forms, and it's muted, but he uses those non-natural colors.
My friends of Texas, I have come here today to bear the tribute of the nation to you on your 100th birthday. For you are 100 years young. And full of birthday parties. A huge $25 million exposition in Dallas with all Texas playing host.
We're in the photo studio at the DeYoung Museum, part of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and we're looking at a painting by an important early 20th century artist, Aaron Douglass, called Aspiration.
Aaron Douglass's first major commission was for the iconic publication, The New Negro, An Interpretation by Alain Locke. In those illustrations, he takes Alain Locke's lead that African-American artists should embrace their African heritage. Historically, Europeans had claimed the history of Africa in general, but especially Egypt as the bedrock of European culture. Douglass and the other artists associated with the Harlem Renaissance were insistent that African Americans embrace this culture as their history.
And we do see the influence of ancient Egyptian art here in the profiles of the figures, in the way that their shoulders are turned frontally, and even the influence of African masks. But this painting had a very specific purpose. It was commissioned for the Texas Centennial Exposition of 1936 that commemorated Texas's independence from Mexico. And for the Hall of Negro Life, that despite many obstacles was created for that exposition.
Aspiration was one of a four-part mural depicting the history of early Texas, but very importantly, from an African-American perspective. Two of the panels are lost, but the other extant panel shows Africans being taken into slavery to a ship that will then cross the Atlantic in the Middle Passage. Aspiration is the other part of the story here on the American side of the Atlantic.
We see hands in bondage. We see the shackles of slavery around the wrists of these upraised hands.
And they are surrounded by these curvilinear flowing waves. This represents the middle passage of ships across the Atlantic Ocean carrying their human cargo of enslaved Africans. Historians often point out if someone on these ships became ill, they were often thrown overboard because the slave traders didn't want to endanger the rest of their human cargo. And so you see these arms upraised as if they are sinking beneath the waves, reaching upward for some kind of salvation.
As we move up, we see three figures on a podium pointing to a city on the horizon.
The three-tiered plinth symbolizes the old, middle, and new kingdoms of Egypt. Egypt was famous for its innovations in architecture, most famously the pyramids.
And we see those pyramids here in the fractured forms between the five-pointed star. And one female figure sits on the corner of that podium, holding a book in her right hand, leaning back and looking up toward the city. Her face, her body intersects that star.
This female figure for Douglass, I think, represents Mother Egypt. She is the font of African Egyptian history and culture. She holds the open books, the symbol of knowledge. And notice that the waves of the Middle Passage wash across her feet, just as the Nile River, when it floods every spring, washes across the temples along its shores. Her hair wig is a very typical symbol of that Egyptian culture, as is her purple color, which is a royal color. So this introduces imagery of kingship, a symbol of pride for contemporary African Americans. The pose of Mother Egypt holding the open book is derived from a Renaissance source, Michelangelo's Libyan Sibyl in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. Sojourner Truth, one of the great freedom fighters against slavery, was known as the Libyan Sibyl. The two modern African Americans on the plinth embody new ideals of the Harlem Renaissance. The figure holding the right angle square, the compass, and adjacent to the terrestrial or celestial globe might be Benjamin Banneker, a famous astronomer and mathematician. The man holding the beaker in the center might be George Washington Carver, who was an agricultural chemist. But there are other associations for these two modern men who embody the educated new Negro. There are three famous figures who might indeed have appeared upon a plinth or podium at this time. Among them are Jesse Owens, the American Olympian, Paul Robeson, the actor and singer, and Joe Louis, the champion boxer. 3 real-life African-American heroes who set an example for the rest of society of the kind of aspiration and achievement embodied in Douglass's painting.
And that idea of being uplifted, of imagining a future where racial discrimination is no more, must have been difficult to imagine in the segregated Jim Crow South of Texas. But still, this sense of hope as the figures look up toward the upper right corner of the composition.
Viewers always notice that the glowing 5-pointed stars point to the city on the hill in the distance. The star could be seen as the Lone Star State, Texas, and the star was all over the fairgrounds in Dallas as a celebratory symbol of the dominant white culture. On the other hand, for an African-American viewer, they would have seen that star as the North Star that led slaves out of slavery in the Deep South to freedom in the North. And not only do the stars radiate from Egypt, but also circles. And Douglass felt the greatest contribution of African-American culture to the world was jazz. And he likened the radiating circles to sound waves spreading African-American culture around the world.
On the opposite corner, a threat looms. We see lightning, we see clouds, and a darkness that the figures turn away from.
Douglass's glowing and radiating stars seem to dispel the darkness. It's not an easy path, but it is possible to triumph and transcend the evils of the past, but also draw nurture from the great accomplishments of the past. When visitors entered the lobby of the Hall of Negro Life and cast their gaze upon Aaron Douglass's 4 extraordinary murals, white visitors, the few that dared to enter the Hall of Negro Life, the segregated building on the periphery of the main fairgrounds, often challenged the attendant at the front desk, claiming that it was not possible that an African-American artist could have created these murals. These queries were so numerous, they actually had to post a sign stating these murals were painted by Mr. Aaron Douglass of New York, an African-American artist.
I'm struck by the incredible optimism of the people who put together the Hall of Negro Life, writing a history to be able to imagine a future in America.
I think that that's pretty amazing. I mean, I see a lot of Art Deco in there as well. That kind of, that really, and for me, Art Deco is a very positive and hopefully futuristic style, and I see a lot of that going on. And some of the things that I think are so fascinating is the layers of symbolism that he put in, and I don't know. I think that those paintings, they still hold up today, 80 years later. They don't feel dated. It's, you look at cover art for Riders of the Purple Sage, and it feels very dated. It's beautiful painting, but it feels very dated. And you look at his work, Aaron Douglass's work, and it feels celebratory, it feels hopeful, and it feels very timeless, I think. What do you guys think?
I don't know. I feel like I agree with everything you said. It has like this incredible optimism. I don't know why, but his like simple graphic style like reminds me of like Toulouse-Lautrec somehow. Feels like a contemporary version of that. Sort of like almost like a poster. But yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful work.
Oh, who's the other guy too? Gustav Klimt, his work too. It makes me feel like that, or Paul Klee. Absolutely. And these are guys that are very popular, top of their form in Europe as well, who also have that classical training that Aaron had, or I should say Mr. Douglass had. So yeah, very much. What is interesting to me is there have been a lot of artists that will produce work that's angry, and justifiably so. But the stuff that we keep going back to, the one movement that was filled with anger that we looked at died out within 10 years. And it is nobody's really interested in it, except for the things that people are surprised to find out that anger's behind it. Like the contemplation of forms moving through space, the person running out of bronze. That doesn't feel like it fits in very well with the manifesto of the futurists. But it is interesting to me how beautiful and hopeful these are. Yes, Brittany.
I was just thinking how, art that, like you were saying, that art that provokes the anger or is driven by the anger or the shock and awe, really, it doesn't last long, that shock and awe, the anger. But like you said, the hope that the happy stuff gives, is inspiring. And I think as humans, we look for hope and we look for happiness. And so we're driven to look at art like that because it gives us a direction.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of an interesting point too, because the church I go to right now is people are pretty positive, people are pretty happy. But I have been to congregations before where everybody talks about the world is going to hell in a handbasket and the neighborhood's coming to an end because those Polynesians moved down the street, and all this kind of, and it's really awful. I actually heard that from somebody. Yeah, the Polynesians moved in, so everything's fallen. And it's sad because you could how you look at the world, like Kevin Kline said in Silverado, you can either live your life like everybody's your friend or everybody's your enemy. It really doesn't make any difference. The world's going to go on and the world's going to continue. It doesn't matter. But before people get lost in the heartache of focusing on the negative, it's important to remember that right now, when you look at the evening news, for example, you are shown 22 minutes that are the most despicable out of the 200 billion or the 2 billion hours of, or no, 200 billion hours of human activity that took place in the last 24 hours. They call the 22 most despicable minutes. And the reality is, every time there's a tornado or an earthquake or a flood, 99% of everybody does not go looting the TVs and destroying shops. 99% of everybody drops whatever they're doing and helps get the neighbor's cat to safety, or they watch after the kids. And that's human nature, is not to be despicable. Human nature is to be hopeful and kind and helpful. And it is, I think art exists to demonstrate or to validate honest human nature. And honest human nature is to look forward. That's, or at least that's the evidence that I can gather, from the last 300,000 years of human history. And so when we look at art that, like Francis Bacon's Screaming Pope, I don't know of very many people that actually enjoy that. And and there is a lot of art that is hard to look at, but you still need to see it. And the beauty does not lie in the happiness of it, the pink daisies. Sometimes beauty lies in honesty. But just like Aristotle said about Greek tragedy, the Greek tragedy is there not to make you depressed, but to incentivize you to move forward and to change your life. And I think that also fits into that idea of hopefulness. So yeah, that's an excellent observation.
Andrew,
Yeah.
I've just been looking at some of Aaron Douglas' pieces, and I've noticed the color palettes that he's been using in most of his pieces, and they're very complementary colors. And I feel like they're very soothing, even though some of the images are identifying some of the very difficult things that have happened that he's been able to be a part of as well as her of. But I feel like the color palettes that he utilized in most of his pieces were very soothing and allowed the viewer to really take in the whole scene and see all of the figures and the silhouettes and what they're doing.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, because what I'm seeing is he's being honest, and sometimes he's being brutally honest,
Mhm.
but he's not being confrontational, and he's not filled with hate. And
Yeah.
that is, that's something else. You can start wars with hateful art, but it's difficult to change the world for, in a sustainable way through hatred and anger. And, and I think that's a really good point, because, and this is when I want to show one more artist, and then I want to show a sculptor. There's other artists, and I'll finish putting them up when we're done. But I think that's a really important thing to point out, what you had to say, Van, because there is a very clear understanding of the language of color. And that's true of every art movement, but I think in particular, these colors seem to communicate honesty without necessarily confrontation, without hateful confrontation. Archibald Motley was towards the end of the Harlem Renaissance, but did a lot of stuff sharing his experience with reality with the broader world. And he was active through the civil rights movements of the 40s, as well as the 50s and into the 60s as well. And it's really interesting to see about his stuff. His work is more the cultural energy that we view as Harlem. And I think where Aaron Douglass really responded to that communication that's comes with jazz spreading out to the world, in a sound waves. I think that Archibald Motley really expresses that the kind of freedom, the cultural freedom that jazz also seems to express. And he did a lot of paintings of nightlife, and we can see that, hot rhythm. He was also did a lot of stuff that I think was very parallel to Edward Hopper, and he painted at the same time as Edward Hopper. We look at Bronzeville by Night, Getting Religion, and Christmas Eve. These remind me very much of Edward Hopper modernist urban landscape paintings. And then even his portraits, this kind of work reminds me of some of the stuff that was being done by like Horace Pippin, for example, but it feels a little bit more approachable. It feels a little bit easier, or a little bit more accessible to read, I think. But it still feels, very modern. So I think some of these paintings are really extraordinary. When I look at the placement of people, it feels to me that he is very aware of, like I said, the Edward Hopper, but also people like Monet, how he would place people in his paintings. And I think that there's some interesting things going on, and it's also very apparent that, it feels to me like there's a little bit of a flavor of kind of a softer, toned down version of the Cubist expression that we saw in things like some of the futurist work that was really focusing on movement and things like that. It's interesting to me that the way the human figures are portrayed, there's a lot of energy. This doesn't feel as full of hope and positivity as Aaron Douglass, but it is really interesting to me to see the kind of work that he's doing. The color palette is very energetic and very bright as well. Now I want to go really quick. There's several other artists. Not all the artists that were produced during, or that came about during the Harlem Renaissance were painters. Not all of them were men. There's some women too, and these women were very remarkable, because again, there is still some cultural stacking against, there's cultural momentum against different people moving forward in their careers in different areas of the world. And it was astronomically difficult for a lot of these people to move forward in their careers. Like at this time, when Augusta Savage was active, women were supposed to be quiet and stay at home. And the fact that she was an uppity girl who had the audacity to be smart and well-trained and a professional, and she was Black. I mean, there were a lot of things that were really amazing about the work that she was able to accomplish. And we look at her stuff, and you have that kind of emotional realism that Auguste Rodin really brought out in his bronze work. And I think it's and Augusta Savage, she did not, I mean, she was classically trained in that European sculptural tradition, particularly early 20th century realism. But what is very cool to me is that she used her facility and talent to share her unique perspective. And and there's some really interesting things going on. I love her stuff. I think it's amazing. And the video that I have for her just is a short video of a film taken of her sculpting in later life. And as she's working, she's smiling. But she's one of these artists that is irritating because they know exactly what they're doing. And she demonstrates it. It's just, I don't know. For me, it's always a lot of work. And I hope it's a lot of work for other people too. But it's a little bit frustrating when the person is just smiling and doing what they want to do, and turns out exactly the way they want it to. Oh well. Now, Meta Fuller is another woman sculptor, and she is also that classically European trained Auguste Rodin's realism style, and where you have, it feels very realistic, but you have it's almost impressionistic take on texture. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And this kind of thing is very contemporary to Auguste Rodin and his immediate influence. The Portrait of a Little Boy, and then you also see her work that is moving towards that Art Deco kind of feel, with the elongated, almost Egyptian style stylization. And then we have her Ushepti, Maquette for Ethiopia Awakening. I think it's absolutely beautiful, the work that she's doing. And then with this, even though it's a little bit older, 1965, it's about 80 years away from Art Nouveau. It feels to me, at the time, civic monuments, they really liked the Art Nouveau style. And so there was a lot of that resurgence. And her stuff is just really, I think it's just delicate and beautiful. So some pretty amazing stuff. And then another woman I want to share with is this time a painter, is Lois Mayu Jones. And her stuff she was very informed by the Harlem Renaissance, and that really pushed her direction quite a bit. But she is a lot more contemporary. So from the 50s into the 80s. And some of her early work is, right solidly at the tail end of the official, really recognized Harlem Renaissance. But it's interesting to me to see how she moved forward. And I love her works like this, where she is exploring the same things that inspired Picasso and Braque to develop Cubism. She's exploring some of those same things, but with her, it feels a little bit more dynamic. And I don't know why that is, but my guess is going to be that there's a little bit more of a connection to the source material that inspired Braque and Picasso. And then her more recent work is kind of graphical stylizations of very traditional Yoruba style animal depiction. And these graphical elements that I think are just fantastic, and they fit very solidly in with stuff that other contemporary artists were doing at the time. I'm thinking, the series Waves. Oh, who's that artist? Willem de Kooning was one of the artists at this time, but I'm thinking there's a couple others that were doing stuff that is similar to this, but it feels to me like she is kind of cresting the wave of several different traditions, and she fits very solidly into that whole realm of Harlem Renaissance and self-determination. I think it's really, I really loved her work too. And you get the very strong Young Moreau surrealism, very strong feeling of Edward Hopper cityscapes, but again with her own unique versions on this. And for whatever reason, this feels to me like an updated Mary Cassatt. I think that's kind of fun. And this reminds me of Frida Kahlo. So it feels to it's all her stuff, unarguably, but it feels to me that she is very aware of what her contemporary artists are doing, and that is really very fun to see. So the rest of the artists I'll put on after we're done, and so you guys, and I'd like you guys look through their work and see what you think. But are you seeing some of the same things that I'm seeing, where these artists are putting their own take on styles and movements that are contemporary to them as well? And I just think it's kind of fun. It shows an engagement on the cutting edge of what creative people are doing, and it also shows a certain amount of audacity and like Frederick Douglass inspired self-determinism. I think it's a beautiful intersection of perspectives. What do you guys think?
I think taking it back all the way to the start of the conversation, where everything was, we see everything through like a white Eurocentric prism. And I think I'm thinking back to that one of the first frames that you showed us was just some portraiture, just some really simple group portraiture. And I'm thinking like that kind of sums all of this work up for me, is that it doesn't seem like that radical from a photography standpoint. So you think about the subject matter that it's depicting, which is middle class, well-to-do, thriving Black families, Black communities. There was a photo of basketball players. There was a photo of, I think, a family or something. I don't know. We looked at it really quick. But then I'm just thinking about, like, these people aren't trying to reinvent the wheel or or really challenge and like move the art world forward. Like just by existing and thriving is a radical act.
Right. Yeah.
It's extremely radical to post that, you know, depict that. And I just keep thinking, you know, success is the greatest revenge. Like this is a group of people that should have an enormous amount of anger, you know, righteous indignation. They should, you know, they would be justified in any sort of, you know, I don't know. I just think about how much, you know, rage there is right now currently, and you just don't see any of it. And that's just, I don't know. It's beautiful. There's a lot of beauty in this.
Well, yeah, it's a direction of energy that I think is really inspiring. You know, it's this idea that however the world is, there's always an opportunity to move forward and build something, and I think that that's really beautiful. There's a lot of contemporary artists that are dealing with traumas of post-colonialism, you know, and the restructuring of identity, who the very best of them are doing the same kind of stuff, where everybody can approach their art and everybody can love it and appreciate it, and it's because they are looking forward to building the kind of world that they're dreaming of, and that's the kind of stuff that I think is just absolutely wonderful. If you get an opportunity, read some of the things that some of the videos and some of the articles they list some of the writers. One of my favorite writers of all times is James Baldwin. It's very difficult for me to read anything that he does without having some sort of catharsis. It's absolutely beautiful. There are a lot of other writers that I love reading just for entertainment, but James Baldwin really makes me think. Viktor Frankl and Hermann Hesse, you know, other people like that there's some Persian poets that I really enjoy, Syed Nasser, but James Baldwin, he will confront the difficult things. He will talk about the horrible indignities and the human tragedy, but he also does it from the perspective of there is a new world that can be had if you choose to take it, and I think that's absolutely beautiful. So yes, very very much. So that is all I have for today right now. Actually, I have a lot more. We could go for another hour, but I don't think that would be very fair. But I will finish putting this up tonight, so you'll see the rest of this, and then I'll have the video posted as well. Any last observations or comments by anybody? All right, in that case, I hope you guys all have an absolutely wonderful spring break, especially you, Brittany. You need to get well and feeling better over the next couple of days. Please take that as a challenge and do your best. Being sick sucks.
It does.
So I look forward to seeing you guys. I think that there is a notice on Teams that we're meeting next Wednesday. We're not going to be, and I will do what I can to take that off. We're not meeting Wednesday during spring break. I will not be available, and I'm really hoping that you guys won't be either. So I hope you guys have a great week and weekend.
Thank you.